Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Ben Chu. I am the economics editor of BBC Newsnight. It's really great to be here. This is a panel entitled How Do We Transform the North's Economy? So big subject matter for us to get into. Let me introduce who we've got on our excellent panel today. We have Tracy Brabin, who is the Mayor of the West Yorkshire. Sorry, I have to check my notes.
Political incident.
Yes. We have Sarah Longlands, who is the Chief Executive of the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. Kate Schumecker, who is the Principal Policy Advisor for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And Gregory Thwaites, who is the Research Director of the Resolution Foundation. So welcome to you all. So let's start by setting the scene a little bit, because I think, I've been covering levelling up and this question about the North's economy for quite a long time now, and it seems to me there's a pretty strong consensus among economists and analysts that the big problem is that the UK's big cities outside London are underpowered relative to where they could and should be. And that's one of the fundamental reasons, fundamental challenges is to bring them up to full power in a way that comparable cities are in the European continent. I mean, just one striking stat, which I think is from Resolution Foundation's Economy 2030 report, which is that look at Paris and its cities. Paris is obviously an incredibly successful capital on a par with London in many ways. But Lyon, France's second city, is 20% less productive than Paris. But if you look at comparable in the UK, London relative to Manchester, Manchester is 30% less productive than London. So that gives you a sort of, and the same is true of lots of other cities, but that gives you an indication of the kind of gap that needs to be filled. And what's the prize for getting this right? What if we can transform the North's economy? Well, I've read an interesting estimate from the Centre for Cities that it could be worth potentially £50 billion a year in GDP. That's 2% of GDP. So that's a really big prize, and I'm sure we'll talk more about some of those numbers as we get into it. But how do we get there? How do we transform the North's economy? Well, this is what all of you on our panel are going to tell us, and we're going to have some insights and questions from you in the audience as well. So what we're going to have introductory remarks from the panel, a couple of minutes, and then we'll have some questions from me, and then we'll throw it open to all of you. So please formulate your questions, get your ideas percolating as we have our discussion. So, we've got about an hour, so lots of time to get into the really interesting and important subjects that we're going to talk about. So why don't we start with you, Tracy? Why don't you tell us your overall views on this question, first of all?
So how do we grow the North's economy? Well, that's a good exam question, isn't it? And I'm sure many people in this room will have their own thoughts. Well, for me, devolution is working. That can help grow your economy in the first instance. But to your point, Ben, about Europe and the comparisons, that most European major cities, 7 in 10 of their citizens can get to the city centre in half an hour. And in our cities, it's 4 in 10. So, of course, that's one of the reasons why we're missing out, and that transport and getting people to jobs, to skills, to opportunities, that connectivity is absolutely key. Now, we have been campaigning for better investment, greater investment in transport in the North for decades. I'm sure many of you have got the scars on your back for many iterations of the Integrated Rail Plan and the NPR and all these other acronyms. But the point is we still haven't got the cash. And we haven't got the leadership at the centre. And a perfect example of that was the cancellation of HS2. I mean, it almost felt like it came out of the blue. A number of people in a hotel room, as Andy Burnham often speaks about, a hotel room ahead of the conference, almost doing a Bella Baxter from Poor Things, of piecing together bits that they could bring together and call it this new investment with Network North. But don't forget that 85% of that money has already been announced. That's already money that is supposedly coming to us. Now, Now, I think for us in West Yorkshire, we were really poorly hit by the integrated rail plan. We were really poorly served in how much money we were allocated. And I am delighted that Bradford has finally got the attention it deserves. It is the only city of its size. It's the youngest city in the country, if not Europe. It's the most diverse. And it has a station where trains come in and then they reverse out again. It's not a through station. So we have been campaigning as mayors for that through station. There's £2 billion in Network North. That's good stuff. And also a commitment to mass transit. Leeds is the only city in Europe of its size without a mass transit. But the whole point is that connectivity. And what we've seen in Network North is you do not get that connectivity if you do not tackle the capacity issues at Leeds City Station. And that is not in Network North. You talk about cities being connected, Leeds and Sheffield. There is nothing in Network North for that electrification, those fast trains from Leeds to Sheffield. Now we've got a population combined, Leeds and Sheffield, 1.4 million, with GDP of 50 million, and one fast train an hour. This doesn't make sense. It's economically illiterate. We have to have that connectivity. Now, I'm really pleased that government are working with Andy and Steve to finally get in the room to talk about what's needed. But actually, you've also got to get myself and Oliver Coppard and friends in North Yorkshire. I don't know if I've lost my mic. But friends in friends in West Yorkshire that North Yorkshire, that we need that absolute integrated, modern, invested in network that will tackle the climate emergency as well. The green investment across east to west that connects us to the rest of the country.
Great, thank you, Tracy. Katie, do you want to tell us your overall views on this subject?
Sure, thanks very much, Ben. I think if we're going to think about how to transform the northern economy, then I think we have to start off with what's the foundation that we need to build from. And the foundation, of course, in many ways is its people. But when we look around sort of what's happened over the last couple of decades, from the work that we do at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we have a really serious challenge facing us of deepening poverty and broadening destitution in the UK. And before some of you are thinking, have I just woken up in the wrong conference? I am going to come back to the issue of transport. But I think it's really helpful just to sort of start there, because I think it gives us a sense of some of the challenges that we need to be tackling. And these are problems that we face on a much greater scale in the north of England compared to other parts of England. We recently had some work out last year looking at levels of destitution. 3.8 million people, 1 million of them children, in 2022 experienced destitution. Earlier this year, we had our sort of State of the Nation report on poverty out, and in the northeast of England, 1 in 4 people experiencing poverty. In Yorkshire and the Humber and in the northwest, almost a quarter, 23% of people experiencing poverty. And that's not just morally wrong, it's also economically extremely wasteful. When you think about it, low-income people, if they have money in their pockets, they spend it. And if we are constraining the spending power of people on the lowest incomes because they're experiencing poverty, because they're experiencing destitution, that holds our economy back. When people feel secure, they're able to invest in themselves, they're able to take risks, they're able to think about things like starting a business. But when you don't feel secure, the things that you are thinking about is, can I make ends meet at the end of this month? Or even, can I put food on the table by the end of this week? That holds our economy back. And we know that poverty is connected to poorer health, poorer education, lower levels of employment. All of those things hold our economy back as well. So if we're going to transform our economy, we need to think about some of the really important fundamentals, in my view. We need to be thinking about a safety net that genuinely protects people. We need to be thinking about housing that's affordable. And of course, we need to be thinking about jobs that not only pay well, but are also able to offer people security. And in that sort of context, transport is such an important facilitator. It's the thing that enables us, just think about your own lives. It's the things that enables you to go to the doctors, to get your kids to school. It's the thing that enables you to visit your friends and your family. It's the thing that enables you to get to work. And also it determines, importantly, the number of jobs that are actually within your reach and the places that you can get to. And so thinking about it from the point of view of like low-income people, I mean, our destitution in the UK report showed how a lack of affordable and accessible transport that went to the right places prevented people from getting the help that they needed. It prevented people from being able to get to that meeting with the council about their housing crisis and their housing situation. It prevented them getting to the Citizens Advice office to go and talk to them about the debts that they were experiencing. And we spoke to one woman as part of the research who had a son who had ADHD, and he had to go monthly for medical assessments to update his medication. The train fare was £3 there, £3 back. But the thing that she said to us, which really has stayed with me, is, you know, when you only have £50 per week, that's a lot of money. And so I think thinking about, you know, the sort of where you can get to, but also how much it costs, is absolutely fundamental here. And when it comes to jobs, transport is often also seen as a barrier. When we have talked to people who live in very deprived areas about kind of how they see their employment prospects and where they can get to and what that means for their employment, they talk about the complexity of fare structures. They don't use that language, but that is what they are describing. They talk about the lack of travel advice and the way in that limits their perceptions of what is possible. So this isn't about people's spatial horizons necessarily. It's not about their ambitions. It's about the practicalities of life. It's about, can I drop my kids off at school and then get to that place to do a job for a few hours and then come back and do it all in reverse and get home again in time to go and visit my mum and take her a meal because I also look after her. It's those sorts of details of people's lives that I think have to be thought about alongside transport in order to think about what's possible. So in terms of what the implications of all of this are, one thing I would say is clearly, I think our system of franchising, and Tracy, I know you're in the middle of conversations in your part of the world, and there are conversations happening in Greater Manchester as well about sort of franchising of particularly of transport, and I think making that far easier and more available to more places is definitely part of it, because then you can start thinking about joining up some of these things around costs and integrating fare options and reinvesting fare revenues. I think thinking about the connectivity of where people live and where economic opportunities are is an important part of it. And then also I think there is something about employment support and the other advice that is available to people, particularly transport advice. So when you are going and having a conversation about what you might do and where you might work, how you're going to get there is also part of that conversation.
Great, thank you, Katie. Sarah, your thoughts?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to come along this afternoon. At CLES, we would argue that the answer to the question about how we transform the North's economy is that we need to increase the flow, the circulation, and the ownership of wealth within the North. And when we talk about the North is such a rich tapestry of different places, and investment in transport and related infrastructure has huge potential to really transform not just the North, but the individual communities and places within it. So as such, transport is a really important place-shaping tool for the future. And for us too, we would argue that there's obviously an argument about getting the investment into the North's transport system in the first place. And we know that the UK generally is a bit of an outlier in OECD terms, in terms of how little we spend on transport infrastructure compared with our European and Southeast Asian neighbours. So, I mean, we know there's an argument about that, but I think there's also something for us about when we actually do get the investment, including the investment that we're currently spending and rolling out in the north of England, how do we really maximise that investment so that we're not just delivering the track and the infrastructure itself, but we're also delivering wider social and economic benefits, the social value or the community benefit, if you like. And I would argue that there's 5 different ways in which you can make that element of transformation happen. First of all, there's the employment and the jobs, actually ensuring that when we're developing new transport infrastructure in the North, that the jobs that we're creating are really going to the people in the North who could benefit most from those opportunities. And that might mean really transforming the way in which we do recruitment, taking jobs to communities, not relying simply on the old ways of attracting people into employment. I think the second thing is about using that infrastructure to make new markets. So we know net zero, climate, the climate crisis, environmental change, They are big topics for the north of England, and investment in transport is an opportunity to create new markets, to create new areas of expertise in net zero and carbon neutral travel. So that's the second thing, really using that investment to perhaps go where current commercial investment is perhaps afraid to tread at the current moment, but kind of really de-risking that for the future. Thirdly, I think setting really strong standards in terms of pay, progression, training, apprenticeships, using that existing investment to really prioritise that, grow the leaders, the transport engineers of the future. We know there's massive skill shortages within actually transport at the current time. Fourthly, I think supporting local businesses. You know, a lot of these contracts are really large, but there's lots that you can do within the procurement process to ensure that the supply chain is really supporting local businesses in terms of small businesses, but also businesses that are really capable of growth in the longer term. And we have lots of those in the north. 99.9% of the businesses in the north are SMEs, and we should be doing more to really integrate them into our procurement and supply chain processes. And then fifthly, there's something about ownership, you know, using ownership of transport infrastructure to really set the standards of what a really good, effective economy can look like. How can we, through that ownership, really build and support the flow of wealth within communities so that we're starting to really deal with some of the challenges that Katie was just referring to. Because there is a lot of wealth in the north, but it isn't necessarily finding itself into the communities who most need it. And it won't do it on its own. It needs intervention to really ensure that that wealth is flowing properly. And so, for example, we've seen in Greater Manchester and other parts of the north where the public sector or where ownership of transport infrastructure is in municipal hands or within the public sector, there's a lot more flexibility to be able to use that imaginatively to really support communities and places across the north. So that's a little bit from me. You know, I think in the time of crises that we have at the minute, I mean, there's so many challenges on the horizon. You know, every day you wake up with some other crisis looming down at us. And I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to stretch and every muscle that we have, every financial muscle that we have, to really support communities. And if we can do that through transport infrastructure investment, if we get it, of course, then so much the better.
Sarah, thank you. It's always nice to have a 5-point plan.
I was very impressed.
Gregory, let's hear your thoughts.
So I'm Greg. I work for the Resolution Foundation, which is an independent national think tank focused on people on low and middle incomes in the UK. As Ben said, we just finished a big project called the Economy 2030 Inquiry. It's a book. Please read the book. Write to me if you want the hard copy. I'd be happy to send it to you. And in that, we talk about all the problems of the UK economy, but we also talk about some of the strengths. And let me start with one of those, which is that the UK is the world's second largest exporter of services, second only to the US. And when we talk about services, we're not just talking about financial services or hedge funds. We're talking about a very broad set of services. So these are creative industries, this is education, this is architecture, lawyers. So it's not just bankers. And so we have very broad specialism in services. We're very good at this. So that's the good news. The bad news is that it's very badly distributed within the UK, and a disproportionate fraction of our services exports and the good jobs that come with them happen in London. That problem's actually getting worse at the moment. And so for me, a big part of answering the question, transforming the North's economy, is about bringing more of this services activity to the North. And I think there's a huge opportunity here. Why is that? So first of all, the thing to remember is that services happen in cities. And the North has lots of very close to each other and, you know, big, large-ish cities. So the North is already set up to do really well from services. What needs to happen, as well as all of the stuff on transport that my fellow panel members have talked about, is we need to get more graduates connected to each other across these cities and within these cities as well. So going back to what Tracy said at the beginning about it taking a long time to get into the city centre, we need to fix that. We need to get more graduates to stick around after they've graduated and more graduates from elsewhere in the country to move to the North. And that's as well about transport, as well as being about transport, that's also about cultural amenities and the places being a nice place to live. We need to think carefully about land use. So there are lots of really lovely city centre apartments in lots of northern cities. But if you put all of the apartments in the city centres, or rather if you fill the city centres with flats, where are the offices going to go? So we need to think about the trade-offs in terms of land use. Maybe it's better to have more dense office business districts in the centre and maybe have better connected apartments around the edges. When we're thinking about the transport budget, we need to think about what different things are going to cost. So I was reading today that the M62 cost about £1 billion in today's money, which seems like extremely good value. So I think when we're thinking about all the different bits of the transport budget we might want to spend or how we prioritize within it, we need to remember that some transport improvements come very cheaply. So the other thing I would say is that with economic success, with services industries, comes problems as well. So you need to remember that London, as well as being an extremely prosperous place, is an extremely unequal place and a very expensive place. And actually, when you look across the country, the richer that local areas are, the more unequal they are. So you compare Gateshead and Islington, for example, the people on lower incomes in both of those two places, their incomes aren't very different. The big difference between Gateshead and Islington is actually at the top. And if you end up with more northern cities having similar industrial mixes to London, for example, in terms of their services exports, this is a really good thing overall in terms of good jobs, tax revenues, and all of the public services that can bring, and the amenities. But it will cause problems for housing costs, problems that we're already seeing, and it will cause problems for local inequality, and we need to think about how we're going to address those. Of course, not every city and not every person can work in these high-value service industries, so we need to think about the local or everyday economy as well. And I think the transport connectivity of places is super important because it will enable people, even if they don't live in these centres, to get to them quickly, and it will enable people to access services, and it'll be quicker and cheaper for them to get goods into those places as well. So if you think about a care worker, which is a key part of the everyday economy, care workers often have to drive, don't they, between one place and another, and if they're spending time stuck in traffic, that's time they're not spending caring for people. And often, by the way, care workers don't get paid for that travel time, which I think is a scandal. So let me stop there. If we were going to remake the Graduate, you know, that movie with Dustin Hoffman, it would be like one word, Raymond, services. That's where I'd stop.
Services, very good. Well, what a well-cast panel, because you've all said very interesting but very quite different things, which I'm going to pick up with each of you for this section while you think of your questions. Tracy, I want to ask you, I mean, look, you know, you made a very compelling case about why HS2 should have gone to Leeds, obviously. That's not the decision that's been taken. We are potentially going to have a change of government, though. Would you be pushing Labour to put it back on the map? Or do you accept that the public finances, it's just too tight at the moment? What's your thoughts on to what extent you should be pushing for this to come right back onto the agenda in the near future?
Well, we don't know when the election is, do we? No. But also we don't know where the salting the earth has happened, because there's been a whole raft of safeguarded land that is potentially now getting sold off. And I think the clock is ticking for Andy Street in West Midlands. I know that the two Andys have been working with DfT and businesses to try and keep that alive. But, you know, I'm a pragmatist as well. I fought very hard against the pulling of HS2. I mean, it does seem an absolute scandalous waste of money. But we are where we are, because in the north we have been continually promised and promised and promised. The problem is we've had no delivery. And actually, I would say and have said to Lou and to Labour, if you come into government, if Labour is gifted that privilege, you have to now deliver for the north. We have to get Bradford Station, spades in the ground on mass transit. I've committed to spades in the ground 2028 on mass transit. You know, we have to get that vision for east to west, and we have to get electrification underway. We have to get this, empower mayors. We're doing it already, but with skills. Whereas the skills programs that will deliver the engineers, that we will need the planners, transport planners, engineers, or whatever in 3 years' time, where's that pipeline? So what I'm saying is, whatever the landscape is like, we cannot now get back into a room and start debating what needs to happen. We just have to take what we have and get underway. And Bradford, for me, is a perfect example. Leeds is really important. A T-shaped station is absolutely vital, and that wasn't in Network North, as I've explained. So Labour have to focus on that, in my opinion, because east to west, Manchester is at capacity, Leeds is at capacity. You will not get this plan when you've got faster trains or more trains because of electrification coming into a station that is already at capacity.
Let me just probe you on that a little bit
Yeah,
more,
sure.
because obviously, do you sense that the dynamic between you and government will change if it was a Labour government? Because you've been very critical of the Conservative government for the decisions it's making. Do you see more of a partner in a future Labour government than you've perhaps had so far, or will it stay the same?
Well, it's a really interesting question, that, Ben, because actually I've been a member of Parliament and I'm now a mayor. And being a mayor is the least sort of party political job. And I work closely with Andy Street.
Yeah.
I'm sad Ben Houchen never comes to my mayor's meetings, but anyway. I think the challenges of mayors is almost place over politics. So I've been able to develop good relationships with Michael Gove and with Mark Harper to try and get the best for our region. And Hugh Merriman has been a good ally when it's come to Bradford. I do believe the vision that Lou Haig has got actually will be transformative and will be about empowering local communities. So I'm looking forward to that. But of course, we may have challenges when it comes to budgets or investment, but actually we will at least be invited around the table. Sometimes, particularly DFE, it has been a challenge, and you think we are all here to work for the citizens we represent. Stop being party political, it's just time-consuming and silly.
Okay, thank you. Katie, I want to pick up on actually something that Greg mentioned about levels of deprivation and incomes around the country, because obviously you were focusing on deprivation in the north, but as Greg pointed out, there's people in London who are very deprived as well. And I wonder what Joseph Rowntree Foundation's view is of this regional approach. Is there a specific case for targeting resources at the north and left behind areas? Or would you prefer a full spectrum approach which just aims to help deprived people wherever they are in the country? How do you think about that regional question?
So I would think about it in two ways. I think the first is to say that there is a level of kind of baseline that we need to get to that we are sadly falling short of at the moment, which is the bit about our safety net that genuinely protects people. So at the moment we have a situation where social security should be, so national policy applies the same in all parts of England and most parts of the UK, some differences in Scotland. But that should be there for any one of us, should we fall on hard times, and patently is now got to a point where it is failing to protect people from the deepening poverty and broadening destitution that we are seeing. So there is a job to do there, which is definitely a job of national government that should be done UK-wide, which is about strengthening that safety net so people can at least afford life's basic essentials. Beyond that, though, I think some of the other challenges that we've been talking about on this panel, it is very much about devolution, and it is about how do you grow the economies of parts of the country which are lagging in ways that actually benefit the people who live there. And I think for me, this is the really important thing, because I think what Greg was saying about people who are living in poverty, who are living in deprived areas in London, facing really serious challenges with things like very high housing costs. It's actually high housing costs that's the big driver of poverty in London. So I think there's a big question facing us in the north as we think about how to transform the economy. How do you do that in a way that we don't just replicate the problems that we see in those parts of the country where they do have much stronger economic performance?
Yeah. Sarah, you make a strong case for sort of trying to maximize the level of economic activity that's taking place in the north, a state-directed way of sort of maximizing the gains. A free marketeer, in response to that, would say that's how you get inefficiencies, that's how you get suboptimal outcomes. Maybe that's even how you get a level of corruption if you don't give it out to whoever is best placed to deliver the projects. I wonder what your response would be in the defense of your model against that critique.
Yeah, I think my response would probably be along the lines of, we've got a system at the minute which isn't working. where growth isn't delivering the promised benefits for communities. And I think, so I think there's something to say about, at a time when the investment in the public sector is at really, all-time lows in terms of the support for people, then we do need to think about what is the state's primary role in investing in communities. And I think it should be about providing that safety net, and it should be about providing the minimum. And when you look at the amounts that have been slashed from children's services, from support for older people in this country, those basic requirements are not being met at the minute. So there is, I think, an element of failure, state failure, because simply that the money cannot be found and it isn't being provided through central government. So I think that's the first thing to say. The second thing is that I think part of this is actually about helping markets to work better. Because I think all too often, when you have large procurement exercises, sometimes they end up going to the usual suspects over and over again, and the usual suspects who are perhaps best able to fill out the forms, to fulfill the to kind of be in to fulfill the compliance guidelines and all the rest of it. And they will also be probably the suspects who have the best information available about opportunities within, for example, transport or within health or education, wherever it happens to be. So I think this is also about making sure that lots of businesses have access to information about tenders or opportunities within the public sector.
Well, that's really interesting. So you're not saying don't have an open tender.
No,
you're
I'm
saying
not saying
level
that.
the playing field so
Yes,
everyone on.
because the playing field's not level at the minute. You speak to lots of SMEs across the north, and they will say, "I don't bother going for those kind of contracts because I don't know enough about them, and they're just going to go to some of those big players anyway." So I think it is about diversification, and also making sure that if there are big tier 1 contracts for large infrastructure developments like HS2 or motorway maintenance, that there's a stipulation that the supply chain has to be diverse, that those bigger suppliers have to really make an effort to support local businesses within their area, because that's how those contracts actually make a difference to people's lives.
And is this the Preston model? Is this what you're describing there, pretty much what they've tried to do?
I mean, I would call it community wealth building. And yes, Preston have done it, but lots of places across the UK have done it. The Scottish Government have got specific legislation to make sure this kind of stuff happens across the country. The Welsh Government have got legislation on the foundational economy, which is about building this into the public sector. Places like Islington, you mentioned Islington. Islington have got a specific plan on this. Cambridge, lots of places now are really trying to take this approach, because they realise there's not a lot of extra money coming through the state, so you've got to try and make the most of the wealth that you have got in your area and make it really work for your communities.
Very interesting.
If I could just
Yeah,
jump
of
in
course,
as well,
Tracy,
Ben, that the mayors are really very alive to this. So when we went out to consultation on franchising the bus network, I made the decision March the 14th, and there were smaller operators saying, it'll only go to the big companies. We are very alive to the idea that there will be routes that will then be the work for local companies that are smaller, family-run businesses and so on. Because that's the way you grow your economy, and that's how you get growth.
That's really interesting, Tracy. Have you run into any potential legal impediments to doing it that way, or is it just a question of will to do it and intention to do it?
I think the thing about devolution and franchising and bringing buses back into public control, as you've seen with Andy here in Manchester, then you have more autonomy. And you can do it that serves your community. And alongside the Fair Work Charter, which we've got in West Yorkshire, and there are versions of it in GM and in Liverpool, where we are ensuring that businesses who come into the family of the Fair Work Charter then also are supported and heard from the Mayor's office, because carrot and stick, that they're doing an amazing thing, paying the real living wage. They've got opportunities for their staff and union membership and progression and so on. So they're now in our family. They get attention and support.
Yeah.
Can I just come like with a funny, slightly, for all, those of you in the room who are procurement, have got like interest in procurement, like a bit of a funny story on that. Well, maybe it's funny, I'm not sure. Let's test it out. But so when we used to go to organisations asking them about the procurement legislation and saying to them, what are you doing to really make these opportunities available to smaller businesses, to the SMEs within your community, they would say, oh, we can't do that because of EU procurement guidelines. And we would say, hang on a minute, yes, you can, because it starts way, way before you get to the tendering process in the design of the services and the design of the spec. So anyway, now we've exited Brexit, so we don't have that excuse anymore. And recently we were talking to Dublin City Council about their procurement situation, and they were saying, well, we can't do that because of EU procurement deadlines.
Right.
And it's like, you know what, there's no legislation in the world that will stop you from writing a tender spec that is designed to support the local economy. Now, you might not be able to use specific words like local economy, but you do want operators to be able to know the community, to know the area, and to have a knowledge and an ethical framework which aligns with the organisation that's tendering. So I think there's just a little bit of a health warning in that about legislation. Legislation is to help us make better decisions and to ensure we avoid corruption, but it shouldn't be an impediment to actually doing the right thing.
Yeah, fascinating. Greg, I want to ask you, I mean, you made the case strongly that the future of the North is services, or rather that would be a very, very important element of it. You know, historically, levelling down was associated with deindustrialisation, isn't it, in the Midlands and the North. So for some people, they still see sort of turning the clock back, don't they? Going back to manufacturing as the way to level up. Is that a myth that we need to banish, or what is the role of manufacturing in this? Is it going to be basically all services with a little bit of advanced manufacturing on the side? Tell us your view of the mix that it will be.
So I think it's certainly true that the UK deindustrialised very quickly, more than most other countries, especially in the north, and that this was handled really badly. But I don't think it follows that it's easy or desirable to try and reverse that process. Deindustrialization is happening around the world. There are 2 or 3 biggish countries that still have lots of industry. So basically Germany, South Korea, and then parts of northern Italy. The rest have got, levels of industry which aren't that much bigger than ours, actually. And some of those are very prosperous countries, like the US is almost as deindustrialized as the UK, and or very equal ones, let's say like France. So of course, there will always be a role for manufacturing. And the UK is very good at some areas of manufacturing, and it's especially important in certain parts of the country. But the idea that we're going to get like a very broad surge in manufacturing employment across the country, I don't see how that's going to happen, and I don't think it's necessary really to rebalance the UK economy. So that would be the main thing I would say about that. Yeah. The important thing is to get jobs evenly spread around the country, get people skilled for those jobs, and then also to support the local or everyday economy. So those are parts of the economy that aren't involved in international trade.
But one thing we do hear from Labour about their Green Prosperity Plan is the jobs it will create. Is there a danger, given what you've just said, that makes people think the future is industrial green jobs? And maybe they need to sort of recalibrate the message.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely some areas of the country where this is going to be important. We've got, let's say, for example, Hull would be an example of a place which is ideally suited to manufacture or produce wind turbines and to help get them connected and installed. But I don't think that that's going to be a very big deal in terms of numbers of jobs around the country. So I think it's still the case. You look at what Joe Biden's done with his, he's trying to revive US manufacturing, and there's been a lot of investment going into factories and manufacturing output. But I think manufacturing employment is still falling even in the US. And that's because it just takes fewer and fewer people to do this, and much fewer than it used to. So our output of manufactured goods is as big as it was before the deindustrialization period. The main thing is that we just need fewer and fewer people to make this stuff.
That's productivity growth for you, isn't it, in that sector, which is great in some ways, but has a downside in others. Tracy, just to come in on that, if you would, what's the mix of manufacturing and services in your area? Because we hear a lot about Birmingham and Manchester being potential services, new superpowers. Where does Leeds fit in?
Well, I just want to slightly gently challenge that about manufacturing, because West Yorkshire has the highest number of manufacturing jobs in the whole of the north. It is really important for us. It is actually a sector that is growing, and particularly in food and drink, and that is manufacturing, but also pivoting the heavy industrial manufacturing of the past to the future. And that's why my target of 1,000 green jobs was really important. I'm really pleased we've hurtled ahead of that target to really upskill the people who've got the muscle memory of manufacturing into those new trades. But to the point about financial professional services, I'm hugely proud, actually, that Leeds in particular, as the largest financial services sector cluster outside of London and Edinburgh, and that's why I was pleased to see that we were first in line when Rachel Reeves and Tulip Sadiq were launching their financial services plan, and they came to Leeds to host a round table. And the 5.3 billion it adds to our economy, we are a global leader in financial services. So that's fantastic, but most of those jobs are level 4 and above. So it's also my job, when it comes to sharing the wealth and the opportunity with my adult education budget that's now devolved, to make sure all those youngsters in West Yorkshire get the opportunity to go into the sector. And I'm really pleased that PwC have taken a new build in Bradford specifically because they see the absolute opportunity for the youngest, most diverse city to get into financial services, to train them up. They were moaning that they'll train them and then they'll go on to another company because they'll be in great demand. But I really am very excited about that balance of manufacturing and also financial services, fintech, health tech, and so on. And we are home of the NHS, with 5 of the HQ's digital NHS as well in West Yorkshire. So, there is a great story to tell.
Very interesting. We're going to come to your questions and comments just in a moment, but I want to just finish this section with you, Katie. When it comes to deprivation and poverty, do you at JRF have a view about the quality of services versus manufacturing jobs? Because there is a view that manufacturing jobs were better, more solidarity, better paid. Services jobs tend to be low wage, high turnover, and just not as good for people. What's your thoughts on the mix?
I think there's nothing innate about either of those sectors that makes that the case. There have been plenty of terrible manufacturing jobs in the past. They're perhaps just not the ones that we still have today. And similarly, there are lots of examples of very good quality and sometimes unionized workforces in services too. So I don't think you choose it by sector. I think the thing that matters here is how are we preparing the pipeline of talent and of people and making sure that people are able to take up the opportunities that there are. And that is about education, is about training and skills and employment support. It's about making sure that people can access those jobs when they are created. They can reach them with the transport network that we have. I think, and that we do, again, sort of through things like the real living wage, through things like the kind of expectations on employers around sort of how they treat their staff, and thinking about sort of quality of contracts and the types of employment that people have. That is how you sort of drive up the pay and the security, I think, rather than kind of thinking about it in sort of two different sectors.
Manufacturing goods, services.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I hope you've got some questions. If you want to put your hand up, we'll get a roving mic to you. So let's start with this gentleman here, right in front. And if you want to say who you are and where you're from.
My name is Peter Eustace. I'm from SLC Property. If we assume that there's a new government in place, we're told that the public finances will be no different to what they are now. So if we assume that the financial pie stays the same, what's the panel think? What one thing could they do with the same amount of money that they could do better in the new government?
Well, very good question. Let's start with you, Greg, because you've done a lot on this specific question, haven't you? So what are your thoughts? The one thing you can do, given that there's not a huge amount of leeway in the public finances.
So just to briefly set the context, I don't know how big your mortgages are, but the government has a £2.7 trillion mortgage on behalf of all of us, and it used to pay 0% interest on that. Now it's paying something like 4%, and that means £100 billion a year, right? So there's you go. There's your HS2 on 1 year's debt interest that we didn't used to have to spend, and that's why we're in the state that we're in. I think that I think there is scope to make the tax system a lot more efficient. We're paying higher taxes now, higher than 70 for the past 70 years, but not especially efficient taxes. So I think we need to change the tax system to boost growth. With that growth will come the revenues that we can spend on transport improvements and also on reducing the poverty crisis in the UK. 2 examples of the tax cuts that we could have. One would be the reform of business rates, which currently penalises investment a great deal because you're taxing the whole value of the asset rather than just the land that it's on. And then another one would be stamp duty, which discourages people from moving around the country and discourages the buying and selling of business assets so that they're the most productive owners. So I would start, rather than starting with spending, I would start with tax, fix the tax system, get the growth, and then there'll be some more money to spend.
Great. And Sarah, I mean, what you propose doesn't necessarily need a lot of money, does it?
Well, no, I guess it's about using the existing money you have much more smartly and seeing public sector spend as the means to develop your economy rather than as separate. The one thing I would do, I think, with that in mind, is to transform public sector recruitment. So instead of having we know that trying to recruit within the public sector across the board costs billions every year because we still can't get the people and because the pipeline isn't there for people coming through. And I think we could take inspiration from what's been happening in the West Midlands, where they have transformed the NHS recruitment process by targeting the options in East Birmingham, some of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the city region, and they've basically been working with communities there to get people interested in the idea of working in health and social care. And no traditional interviews, but just a conversation, a cup of coffee, getting people thinking about it, getting people the support they need in terms of training, and getting them on the pipeline. People who've never been employed for years and years and years, suddenly getting really good jobs within the health and social care, and they've got like around an 85% retention rate. I think, imagine if we could do that for the whole of the public sector across the UK. That could make a massive difference to some of our communities on the margins. So that's what I would use the existing money for, to transform public sector recruitment.
Okay, great. Katie, one thing you can do doesn't necessarily cost more money in terms of spending or tax.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is I really agree with what both Greg and Sarah have just said. And I think we kind of need to ask ourselves the question, like, what does it actually mean to be fiscally responsible? Is it fiscally responsible to have public services that are not supporting people to get the education that they need, that are not enabling people to access the healthcare that they need? What impact is that then having in turn on our economy? Is it fiscally responsible to have very large numbers of people in our country who can't afford the basics, can't make ends meet, are experiencing poverty and destitution? And I would say, no, it's not, actually. So I kind of feel like we're sort of slightly asking the wrong question, which is why thinking about, well, okay, how do we do things differently to create the resource that we need to, whether that's to move it or to raise it through taxation, is the question that we should actually be asking. But the question you just asked me, though, is like, what are the kind of low-cost things that could make a difference here? There definitely are some. I mean, there are high-cost things that I also think we need to do, or higher-cost things I think we need to do. But there are low-cost ones too. So one of the things that I would highlight is thinking at the sort of very local level, how do you connect together the energy and commitment and enthusiasm and sort of connection and sort of sense of purpose that comes from work, like the work that people do within communities, whether that's through the community sector and the voluntary sector and the services that are provided in that way. How do we connect that better to the local services that are provided through our local authorities, through our health service, through neighbourhood policing and all the rest, to actually stitch that together so that people are able to, always have someone and somewhere to turn to when they're in times of need. There are things like income maximisation, just building that into other services. Are people actually getting the benefits that they're entitled to? Are people accessing the employment support they might be entitled to? Are they getting the free school meals their kids might be entitled to? Just building that into more places would make a huge difference to people's lives.
Joined up government. Tracy, your thoughts? And I don't think HS2 back on the menu.
No, it doesn't look like it. One thing that won't cost more money, and that is the single settlement that you've seen in GM and West Midlands. We have to get deeper devolution, because that's how, with the same pot, you can get better outcomes. Because it can't be right that communities have to go into local authorities into beauty contests that we're also having to bid into, spending thousands, hundreds of thousands on a bid, then not to be successful. And we've seen, haven't we, some of the pork barrelling that's been going on. If you give mayors and mayoral combined authorities a single settlement that they know how to spend this money with better outcomes, that's the way to do it. And that's the case we're making to the Labour Party, and I know that Gordon Brown has been leading on that work as well, that we can be helpful when it comes to growth. We can help grow the North in particular, that will help growth across the whole of the UK.
Great. Let's have some more questions. If you want to raise your hand, catch my eye. The lady over there, get the mic to you.
Thank you. My name's Ellen Collins. I'm from Deloitte. The question I want to ask is about case making in infrastructure and in transport, given the theme of today. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room know how difficult it can be to make an economic case for improving in infrastructure. So how do you think we can do that more holistically, taking in some of the outcomes you've discussed today around jobs, employment, education, looking kind of beyond just numbers and thinking about the narrative as a whole?
Well, Tracy, do you want to field that? Because you
Yeah.
made the economic case, but is there a way of reinforcing it?
Well, I think, thank you very much for that question, because often we're on panels talking about the numbers and the economy, but actually what is it like to live in a region? And can you wake up in your affordable house, get outside to the street and there is a bus that turns up and there are trees in your street? Can you take your child to a relatively inexpensive nursery where they can go out to forest play or go to the river? And then can you see something in the evening that's subsidized? It doesn't cost you an arm and a leg to see some culture that you can share with your families. And that's why, as mayor, I've made culture one of my, sort of foundation commitments, because it's an opportunity. It's already a sector that's growing. You invest in that sector, it's going to grow faster. And in fact, we've seen 3 times as many jobs in creative sport and heritage in West Yorkshire than the rest of the country. And I would say that's because of our years of culture, but also our commitment to culture. But also, looking at mass transit, this is going to be an absolute transformational infrastructure project that's going to cost a fortune, but what's it like to live next to your mass transit? So that's why we've done a piece of work on biodiversity, on how it would look, how the environment would be, how accessible is it. I was just on a previous panel about diversity in transport. Who is this for? And being able to be a representative of your community and be able to listen because you live in that community, I think that's where devolution really comes into its own, because Whitehall and Westminster making decisions about transformational plans on transport, housing, whatever, you cannot do it unless you absolutely devolve those powers to people on the ground. It's more cost effective, you get more bang for your buck, but actually it creates more beautiful, livable spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about the consensus about big cities need to be more powered and stronger than they should be, but the devolution is another thing which I think economists and analysts really agree on now. That's the way that's the secret sauce of getting all this spending and everything else to work. Does anyone else like to ask a question? Gentlemen, let's have this gentleman here. There's a mic behind you.
Yeah, Steve Fowkes, Chair of the Local Transport Committee for our LGC. I just want to explore more this ability to spend the Northern Pound in the North and contract and procurements, because we've been through a number of procurement exercises. One, you can see the Mersey Ferry there. We managed to get the Mersey Ferry being built at a local shipyard, Canal Airs, but it was not an easy process, I can tell you that. It was so difficult. So I think there are still barriers there, and what more can we do to break them barriers down?
Very interesting. Sarah, I suppose you want to field that one.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It can be really challenging, and I think particularly where you don't have a lot of sort of obvious providers as well. I think that can often be a challenge too, where you want to commission a new service, but you don't necessarily have a large pool of organisations from which to draw tenders from. So I think there are real challenges. I think sometimes just about the kind of the legislation itself and what you can and can't do within it, and often different you know, you go to one legal person, they give you one opinion, you go to somewhere else, they gives you a different opinion. So there can be a bit of a challenge in terms of just getting good advice on it, and consistency of advice. But I think when you look at the government's own procurement bill, which is now law, and the Levelling Up white paper, both of those place a huge emphasis on using procurement, and actually, although this is another, you know, can of worms, pension funds, you know, imaginatively to support local economies. So I agree, it isn't necessarily a quick win, and it does depend on what you're tendering for. But I think it is about trying to identify, out of the money that you spend, what can I influence more easily? You know, what's the spend that I've got that could be influenced, that could be supported, where I could build relationships with local providers, so that they're even aware that I'm thinking of tendering this piece. So I know in other areas, just a final thing to say, in other places, there's also been a discussion about how do we use this as a business development opportunity to encourage new business growth, new business startup, and both in terms of traditional businesses, but also cooperatives and smaller social enterprise. So that's another element of do. But yeah, it's not necessarily it can depend on what you're procuring. It's not necessarily a quick one.
Yeah, and Greg, can I ask you, is that something that you looked at in your Economy 2030, this idea of local procurement as a lever to help areas?
We didn't focus on that, and I've learned a lot about how important it is today, yeah, so I'm looking forward to learning more about that.
Right. Okay, any more questions? If you want to stick your hand up. Gentleman, let's go for that gentleman there first, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Alan Weston, Tees Valley. We've heard a lot about cities, but some of us have very deep-rooted deprivation issues outside of those cities, and they have very long distances to the nearest cities. So just wanted to hear the panel's views about some of those more rural issues, or particularly for those of us that have more, shall we say, urban town living and opportunities rather than city focus, because I think there's a real danger that we actually focus so much on, picking up somebody else's point earlier on, we focus so much on the cities because of the numbers games that gets played in business cases, and actually, as the panel said, it's those real lived experiences of people who are outside an hour by train of those city centres. How do we ensure that they can benefit from what we're doing as well?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There was a very big debate, wasn't there, a few years ago about towns versus cities, and the extent to which boosting cities creates a problem for those outlying areas. Tracy, how do you think about this question? Is a stronger Leeds good for the villages and rural areas around Leeds?
Well, of course, stronger cities, greater employment, more opportunities. Our colleges, our universities, young people from rural areas will probably go to those colleges and universities. So it is about connectivity, it's about a rural transport plan. But also, it was very disappointing that the Shared Prosperity Fund, which was, for those that may not know, was a replacement for the EU funding. It was two-thirds in West Yorkshire of what we'd had before. 2.5 million was allocated specifically to rural. Now, we have found actually identifying and encouraging businesses to get involved and to pitch for that money also challenging. So it's trying to raise the profile of mayoralities for rural communities, that we are also there for you, and to give them opportunities, particularly around the solutions when it comes to the climate emergency, and whether that's greening their businesses. We've got a £10 million fund that supports businesses to, whether that's new boilers or new lighting, and that's been quite oversubscribed. But to be able to say to rural businesses and communities that we will focus and help you with connectivity. It is also about opportunities for your youngsters to get skills and training, but also we have cash and resources, and that, getting the message out there, and maybe there's been a communication challenge there to make sure that rural businesses know that we can help.
Very good. We are coming towards the end, but there's a gentleman there who wanted to ask a question, so I'd like to give him the mic.
My name's Joe Jolly for Network Rail Shared Services in Manchester. Before the pandemic, we started to realise there was a decline in recruitment for Network Rail engineers, and now we're starting to see that more often now after the pandemic, and we think that's the reason to that is two reasons. One, because compared to the Northern Transpennine, staff get free travel. Network Rail, we don't. We only get 75% off for leisure travelling. And the second thing is because of climate change, which obviously we all probably know what's going on around the world. The climate's changing. So my question is to you all is, what is your any ideas or any backups you've got to combat with climate change to try and transform the northern economy? Because obviously, if the climate's going to change, people's travel habits, people's daily habits are going to change, and because of the climate. And how would you have a backup for that to protect the northern economy?
Yeah, gosh, that's a big question, isn't it?
It
The
is,
impact
isn't
of the of climate change on the north. I don't know, Sarah, do you have any specific thoughts about that? Or?
Yeah, well, it maybe kind of links slightly to the question previously as well. Some of the research that's been done on the north, particularly in terms of our natural assets, if you like. We have, probably more national parks in this region, more important natural reserves of ecosystems and resources than potentially any other region of the UK. So there's something about how we think about the economy in its broadest sense, and we think of wealth in its broadest sense. So, many of those rural areas that we were just talking about, they've got, really important ecosystems, really important carbon reserves, protected landscapes, which are essential for visitor economy. So I think there's something about us really working to support and enhance and regenerate some of those ecosystems so that they're really working hard to absorb as much carbon as we can in the future. And of course, there are real jobs associated with that type of work as well, particularly in terms of upland restoration, and that's also then, of course, preventative in terms of flooding and in terms of fire and air pollution. So I think that would probably be my answer to that, really harnessing the potential of that, and the north really kind of making the most of that brilliant opportunity.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's been a great panel, really interesting. I mean, my big takeaway actually is that, it's a transport conference, it's economic focus, but transport is a means to an end. Mm-hmm. It's not an end in itself. It's about all those things, because of deprivation, quality of life, local empowerment, better outcomes for everybody. That's the goal, and transport is a way to get there. So that's really clarified that for me, and I hope you all found it really as interesting as I have. So if you'd all join me in thanking Greg, Sarah, Katie, and Tracy. Thank you very much.